In 1943, the United States Department of Agriculture mailed a home economics bulletin to American households across the country. It contained recipes for cornmeal mush, buckwheat pancakes, fried mush, and molasses biscuits. That same year, Kellogg's was running national radio advertisements for corn flakes, two versions of the American breakfast competing for the same kitchen table. One required a pot, a fire, and 30 minutes. The other required a bowl, some milk, and 15 seconds. By 1965, most American kitchens had forgotten the first version existed. What follows is a documented account of what was on that table before the bowl won. 20 breakfasts that most Americans alive today consider simply traditional is the newest meal at this table. What it replaced had been here for 200 years. Before the cereal box, there was the pot. Before the instant, there was the overnight. Before the brand, there was the bushel. The American breakfast table in 1900 contained more grain variety than any subsequent generation would recognize, not because Americans were more sophisticated, but because grain was what most households had. You grew it, bought it in bulk, or received it as part of a barter arrangement, and you learned every way it could be prepared because you had no alternative. What follows is what that looked like. 1. Cornmeal mush. Ground corn simmered in water or milk until thick, salted, eaten hot from the pot with a pat of butter and a pour of molasses. This was the American breakfast for a significant portion of the population, from the colonial period through the early 20th century, and in rural and working-class households well into the 1940s. The USDA's own home economics bulletins of the 1930s promoted cornmeal mush explicitly as an economical morning staple, not as a historical curiosity, as a recommendation. Those bulletins were mailed to households that needed them because the families receiving them had no margin for expensive food and a significant amount of time at home. Cornmeal was cheap, the fire was already lit, the pot was already there. A meal that cost almost nothing and fed a family of 5 through the morning was not a poor substitute for something better, it was the rational choice. The same decade those bulletins were circulating, Kellogg's and Post were spending heavily on national advertising to position cold breakfast cereal as the modern, scientific alternative to the cooked morning meal. The language was direct. Cold cereal was clean, efficient, and progressive. The cooked grain was the food of an older, slower, less enlightened America. The mush and the corn flake were made from the same grain. One required 30 minutes and a stove. The other required a box and a distribution network. The question of which one was better was never really asked. The question of which one could be marketed was answered very clearly.
2. Fried mush. If cornmeal mush was the breakfast, fried mush was the morning after. You poured the leftover mush from the previous evening into a pan, let it cool overnight, sliced it cold in the morning, and pan-fried it in lard until the outside was crisp and browned. The inside stayed soft. You ate it with molasses or maple syrup. Depression-era USDA home economics bulletins documented fried mush explicitly as an anti-waste preparation, a way to ensure that nothing from yesterday's pot was discarded before it had been used completely. Fried mush didn't disappear because it was unpleasant. Anyone who has eaten it will confirm it was not unpleasant. It disappeared because prosperity made waste affordable. When packaged food became cheaper than the labor of managing leftovers, the economic logic that sustained fried mush ceased to exist. You didn't need to fry yesterday's mush when you could open a box. The practice had no argument left. 3. Johnny cakes and hoe cakes. Cornmeal flatbreads appeared at the American breakfast table under different names depending on where you were standing. In New England, particularly Rhode Island, they were Johnny cakes, made from white flint corn ground to a specific texture, cooked on a griddle until the edges set and the interior stayed slightly soft.
Rhode Island white flint corn Johnny cakes had documented regional production and were considered a protected regional specialty. In the South, they were hoe cakes, thinner, crispier, cooked in the same pan that had just held the morning's salt pork. Two different preparations, two different regions, the same underlying fact. Corn was what you had, and you made it into something that could be eaten quickly in the morning before the work began. The standardization of the American breakfast is also the erasure of American regional food identity. Both disappearances happened at the same time for the same reasons. The Johnny cake and the hoe cake did not lose to a better flatbread. They lost to a breakfast that was the same everywhere, by design.
Buckwheat pancakes. This one requires a moment to understand because the pancake itself is not the interesting part. Buckwheat pancakes, made from buckwheat flour rather than white wheat flour, were the dominant pancake variety in northern and mid-Atlantic states through the early 20th century. Fannie Farmer's 1896 cookbook includes them. The White House Cookbook of 1887 includes them. Period farm household records include them. They were not a specialty item. They were the pancake. The batter was fermented overnight in a sourdough-style preparation. You mixed it the night before, let it sit, and it was ready when the stove was lit in the morning. This was not a culinary preference. It was a practical solution to a specific problem. In a household without electricity, without instant heat, without a gas range that could be turned on and have water boiling in 3 minutes, you could not afford to wait for batter to come together while the family was already working. You prepared it the night before because the morning had no time to spare. USDA crop production records document the sharp decline of buckwheat cultivation in the United States from a peak in the 1860s and 1880s through the mid-20th century. Mechanized wheat farming drove white flour prices below anything buckwheat could match. The price war was not fought in kitchens, it was fought in commodity markets that most American households never had occasion to think about. But the result arrived at the breakfast table: white flour pancakes, thicker, faster, made from a batter that required no overnight preparation because electricity and instant heat had eliminated the problem the overnight batter was built to solve. The buckwheat pancake solved a problem that no longer existed, so it was forgotten. That pattern will repeat. Hominy. Whole hominy, dried corn kernels processed through nixtamalization, soaked in a lye or calcium hydroxide solution until swollen and tender, then cooked as a morning grain, was a standard breakfast food in the South and rural Midwest through the early 20th century. It did not disappear entirely. You can still find it in a can in the soup and stew aisle in most American grocery stores. But it stopped being breakfast. It migrated completely out of the morning context, out of the pot on the stove, out of the bowl beside the eggs, and into a category of ingredient that most Americans under 60 have never thought to eat before noon. The food survived. The use of it didn't. That distinction between a food that still exists and a breakfast that is gone will appear again before this video is finished. 5 breakfast preparations from grains that were grown, milled, and cooked at home or bought in bulk and prepared at home by most American families as recently as 80 years ago. The American breakfast table in 1900 had more grain variety than most people alive today have ever encountered in a single meal. What replaced all of it was one product category: cold cereal in a box, purchased ready to eat, requiring nothing but a bowl and milk, and discarded when the box was empty. That transition was not inevitable, it was manufactured. But the mechanism of manufacture comes later.
Before industrial refrigeration reached American households, which for most rural families meant sometime in the 1930s, 1940s, or in some cases the 1950s, the breakfast protein had to be preserved. Salt, drying, curing, brining, smoking. These were not culinary techniques in the decorative sense. They were food safety technologies. Every protein at this table existed because refrigeration did not. 6. Salt pork and fatback. Before strip bacon became the universal American breakfast meat, the morning protein for most working-class and rural households was salt pork, thick slabs of cured pork fat, often from the belly or back, stored in brine in a barrel in the cellar. You pulled a piece, rinsed it, and fried it. the fat rendered into the pan. You used the fat for everything else. Nothing left that pan unused. The shift to strip bacon tracked the industrialization of pork processing through the 1920s and 1930s. Oscar Mayer, Swift, and Armour built the infrastructure that made uniform, pre-sliced, packaged bacon available nationally. The product required a refrigerator to store. The refrigerator required an electrical connection. The electrical connection was something the companies selling refrigerators were actively working to make universal. At the same time, and this is where the story becomes worth paying attention to, a public relations campaign was underway to change what Americans believed a proper breakfast required. The campaign was commissioned by a major bacon producer. The approach was not to advertise bacon directly. It was to change the cultural definition of a hearty breakfast. The name behind that campaign will appear at the end of this video, because the full weight of what he did is best understood after you have seen everything it displaced. 7. Salt cod and codfish cakes. In New England, Saturday morning was codfish cake morning. Dried salt cod, Atlantic cod preserved in heavy salt, dried until stiff, was soaked overnight in cold water to draw out the brine, then flaked, mixed with boiled potato, formed into cakes and pan-fried. The preparation was standard enough in Boston to appear in City Health Department menu records, hotel breakfast guides, and school food documentation from the early 20th century. It was not a specialty item. It was the expected Saturday morning preparation in a region where cod had shaped the economy for 300 years. Two things ended it. Industrial refrigeration made salt-preserved fish unnecessary. If you could keep fresh fish cold, you didn't need to preserve it in salt. And industrial fishing, operating at a scale that natural cod stocks could not sustain, collapsed those stocks through the mid-20th century. NOAA data documents the collapse in detail. By 1980, you could not make a traditional New England codfish cake for the same reasons you cannot make one today. The salt cod is expensive. The cod stock is depleted. The overnight soaking is a preparation that almost no living cook remembers performing. 3 generations, completely gone from the table that once expected it every Saturday, without exception.
Creamed chipped beef on toast. 16 million Americans ate this in military mess halls during the Second World War. Most of them hated it. The soldiers had a name for it that appeared in military slang references well before the war ended. 2 of those words were on a shingle. The other is not included here. Thin sliced dried beef folded into a white cream sauce served over toast. It was institutional food in the truest sense. Cheap, filling, reproducible at scale, and made from preserved meat that required no refrigeration in the field. It was not designed to be enjoyed. It was designed to keep men functional. Then the war ended. The men came home, and creamed chipped beef on toast appeared in American home cookbooks of the late 1940s and early 1950s. It is not entirely clear what they were remembering when they made it at home, but they made it. For perhaps 15 years, the dish held a place in American domestic cooking. Not a beloved one, but a documented one. Then it retreated back into institutional settings, where it has remained. The commercial product still exists, in quantities suited to cafeterias and care facilities. It never successfully made the permanent transition to the American household. The attempt lasted 1 generation and left quietly. Scrapple. You made scrapple in winter after the hog was killed from the parts that didn't keep and couldn't be sold. Head meat, liver, heart, and other trimmings were simmered with spices until the meat could be pulled from the bone, then mixed back into the cooking liquid with cornmeal until the whole thing set into a loaf. You sliced it cold in the morning, fried it in the pan, and ate it with molasses or apple butter. Pennsylvania Dutch and German immigrant communities brought the preparation to the Mid-Atlantic. It is documented from the 18th century. Commercial producers, Rapa brand, Haberset, still exist in limited form in Pennsylvania and Delaware. But scrapple was never a product of industry. It was a product of necessity. You made it because a hog had just been killed, and you were going to use every part of it. Industrial pork processing eliminated the moment of production entirely. The parts that went into scrapple now go into other industrial products, or are discarded, or are processed in ways that have no connection to the winter kitchen of a Pennsylvania farm household. The commercial scrapple you can still buy in the Mid-Atlantic is real scrapple in every technical sense, but the economic logic that created it, waste nothing from the slaughter because nothing can be wasted, no longer applies to anyone buying it. The tradition survived. The reason for the tradition is gone. Every protein at this table was a preservation technology. Salt, drying, curing, brining, methods refined over centuries to solve the problem of keeping meat edible without refrigeration. Industrial refrigeration did not improve these foods. It made the problem they solved obsolete. And when the problem disappeared, the foods followed, in most cases within a single generation, with almost no public acknowledgement that anything had changed.
In most American households through the mid-20th century, the economics of the kitchen operated on a simple principle. Nothing that could be used was discarded. The breakfast table was not exempt from this. Leftover grain became the next morning's meal. The byproduct of one process became the ingredient of another. The abundance of one season was preserved and consumed in the next. The moment that calculus changed, when packaged food became cheaper than labor, when rising incomes made waste an option, these foods did not decline slowly. They stopped making sense, and foods that stop making sense disappear very quickly. 10. Cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. This is not a recipe, it is a practice. Cold leftover cornbread, broken into chunks, dropped into a glass of cold buttermilk. You ate it with a spoon or you drank it. The Federal Writers Project oral histories from the 1930s and 1940s, recorded by interviewers across the rural South and Appalachian communities, reference this practice consistently, not as something remarkable, as something ordinary. Evening cornbread became morning breakfast. The buttermilk was the byproduct of churning. Two things had to disappear before this practice could disappear. Home butter churning had to end, so there would be no buttermilk byproduct, and daily cornbread baking had to end, so there would be no leftover cornbread. Both ended. Commercial butter replaced home churning. Packaged bread replaced daily baking. The practice had nothing left to sustain it, and it went without ceremony in the specific communities that had kept it between roughly 1940 and 1970. 11. Molasses on biscuits. This sweetener that covered the biscuits at most American breakfast tables through the early 20th century was not jelly, it was not syrup, it was not honey. It was molasses. Dark, thick, slightly bitter, intensely flavored, poured directly from a jug onto a split biscuit or a piece of cornbread. USDA commodity data from the period shows the transition precisely. In 1880, the average American consumed approximately 8 pounds of refined white sugar per year and significantly more molasses. By 1920, that ratio had effectively reversed. The industrialization of cane and beet sugar refining drove the price of refined sugar below anything molasses could compete with. Molasses went from being the affordable sweetener available to households of every income level to being an industrial byproduct, useful for rum production and animal feed, no longer the practical choice for the morning table. The switch from molasses to refined sugar is also a nutritional story, but this video is not in the business of telling you how to feel about that. The documented price data is what it is. The consumption shift followed the price. That is what the record shows.
Fried tomatoes. In summer and early fall, when the kitchen garden was producing, sliced tomatoes, green or ripe, were dredged in flour or cornmeal and fried in butter or lard for breakfast across the South and parts of the Midwest. Fannie Farmer included preparations for fried tomatoes. Period Southern cookbooks treated them as a standard breakfast side. USDA kitchen garden surveys document widespread home tomato production across this period. The garden was not a hobby, it was a food source. The supermarket changed this in two ways. It provided tomatoes year-round, which broke the seasonal logic that made a fresh August tomato at breakfast feel like an occasion. And it provided tomatoes bred for shipping and shelf life rather than flavor, which meant the product available at the breakfast table was not the product the preparation was designed for. The supermarket gave Americans access to tomatoes in January. It also gave them a tomato that wasn't worth frying. The practice and the ingredient it required disappeared at approximately the same moment. Stewed prunes. In the 1880s through the 1950s, stewed prunes were a near-universal first course at the American breakfast table. Not occasionally, routinely. Hospital menus included them. Hotel breakfast records included them. School cafeteria documentation included them. Period cookbooks treated the preparation as a default, something you made without consulting a recipe because it was simply what was done. You simmered the prunes in water until they were soft and plump, served them in a bowl with the cooking liquid, and ate them before anything else. The decline was generational and gradual. By the time the California Prune Board commissioned research on their consumption problem in the 1990s, the data was unambiguous. Younger Americans were not eating prunes in any form, stewed or otherwise. The industry identified the name as the liability. In 2000, the FDA formally approved the California Prune Board's request to rename the product. Prunes became dried plums. New packaging, new marketing, new language for an old fruit. The stewed preparation had been gone from most American kitchens for 30 years by then. Renaming the fruit did not bring back the pot. Every food in this section existed because waste was not an option. The garden produced tomatoes in August and you used them. The buttermilk came from churning and you drank it. Last night's cornbread became this morning's breakfast because discarding it was not something most households did. The moment that calculus changed, when packaged food became cheaper than labor, when prosperity made leftovers optional, when the kitchen garden gave way to the supermarket, these foods did not decline, they simply stopped making sense. And things that stop making sense disappear without requiring anyone to decide to end them.
The American breakfast was not one thing. It was dozens of things, shaped by what grew nearby, what the season allowed, what the ecology provided, and what immigrant tradition carried forward into new geography. Standardization did not just change what Americans ate in the morning, it erased the record of how different that morning had been depending on where you were standing. Ham and red-eye gravy. Country ham, dry-cured with salt, aged for months, intensely flavored and deeply red, was fried in the morning in a cast-iron pan across the South. When the ham was done, black coffee was poured directly into the hot pan to deglaze it. The result was thin and dark and not quite like anything else, red-eye gravy, named for the small circle of fat that settled in the center of the liquid. You poured it over the ham, over the biscuits, over whatever was on the plate. It required a specific thing to make it. Not just any ham, but dry-cured country ham with the fat content and the absence of added water that industrial processing would later make hard to find at a reasonable price. The USDA documented the shift from traditional dry-cured country ham to industrial brine-injected ham in the post-World War II period. Brine injection adds water weight, extends shelf life, and produces a cheaper product that reaches more markets at a lower price point. It also produces a ham that cannot make red-eye gravy. The added water and reduced fat content produce the wrong result in the pan. This is not a matter of culinary opinion. It is a documented physical consequence. Red-eye gravy did not disappear because Americans stopped wanting it. The ham that made it possible was replaced by a product that could not perform the same function. The distinction was never explained to anyone. The gravy simply became something that fewer and fewer people knew how to make because fewer and fewer people had access to the ingredient it required. And eventually, it became something that only certain households in certain parts of the South still knew at all. Oysters at breakfast. In the 19th century, oysters were cheap. In coastal New England and mid-Atlantic communities, they were sometimes cheaper than bread.
a working-class food available to households that could not afford beef, served as oyster stew or fried oysters at the morning table before the day's labor began. NOAA's documentation of natural oyster bed collapse in the Chesapeake Bay, Long Island Sound, and New England is extensive. Industrial harvesting at a scale the beds could not sustain, combined with water quality degradation from coastal development, destroyed the resource that made oysters a cheap food. When the supply collapsed, the price rose. When the price rose, oysters became a luxury. The breakfast that had been economically rational for a working coastal household became, within a generation, the kind of thing that happened at a restaurant on a special occasion. The ecology changed, and the meal changed with it.
Liver at breakfast. On a farm, immediately after slaughter, the organ meats were the first things eaten because they were the first things that would spoil. Liver, heart, and kidney appeared at the breakfast table not because farm families had an unusual appetite for organ meat, but because the alternative was waste, and waste was not an option. Steak and pork chops at breakfast. In mining camps, logging camps, and agricultural labor communities, the morning meal was caloric before it was anything else. Company store records and labor camp documentation from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show high-calorie morning meals including beef and pork not as a luxury, but as the fuel required to perform physical labor for 10 to 12 hours in conditions that would be unrecognizable to most American workers today. 2,000 calories before 8 in the morning is not excess if the work being done burns 4,000 by noon. The physical conditions that made a steak at breakfast rational were themselves a product of a specific economic moment, before mechanization removed the heaviest labor from most industries, before the American workforce shifted predominantly towards sedentary work. The meal didn't become unfashionable. The body that required it became less common. Fried apples. In Appalachian and Southern households where apple orchards were a part of the household economy, sliced apples fried in butter with sugar or molasses until soft and caramelized were a standard breakfast side through the mid-20th century. Not an apple product purchased from a store, apples from trees in the yard or the near orchard, stored through winter in a root cellar, available in the morning because they were there. The kitchen garden gave way to the supermarket. The root cellar gave way to refrigeration. The apple orchard that had been a household food source became, in the suburban context that absorbed most of rural America's population after World War II, a landscaping feature if it existed at all. Fried apples survived in some households and on some southern restaurant menus, where they remain a regional marker. But the daily practice, the apple from the cellar, fried in the morning pan, belongs to a domestic economy that no longer exists. The American breakfast in 1920 was not one meal. It was dozens of meals, shaped by region, ecology, season, income, and immigrant tradition. Every entry in this section describes a breakfast that was entirely normal to the people who ate it and entirely invisible to everyone outside the geography where it was eaten. The version that exists today, the one most Americans consider simply breakfast, the default, the obvious choice, did not emerge from this variety through natural selection. It was placed there deliberately, and the mechanism of that placement is worth naming directly. Everything that preceded this section disappeared. Something replaced it. The question this video has been building toward is not what disappeared, but how the replacement was arranged. Because the breakfast that now occupies the space left by cornmeal mush, salt pork, red-eye gravy, stewed prunes, buckwheat pancakes, and everything else on this list did not arrive by accident or by merit. It arrived because specific people working for specific institutions with specific financial interests made deliberate decisions to put it there. 19. Oatmeal and the first manufactured breakfast. Quaker Oats was established in 1877. The iconic round canister was in national distribution by 1915. It was one of the first nationally branded grocery products in American history, and one of the first food products sold through advertising that made health claims on behalf of the food itself. The campaigns were direct. Oatmeal was scientific nutrition. Oatmeal was what informed modern American families fed their children in the morning. The implication, never quite stated, always clearly present, was that cooking your grain from a bulk sack without a brand on it was the choice of a household that didn't know better. Oatmeal did not win the hot cereal market because it tasted better than cornmeal mush. It tasted different, not categorically superior. It won because cornmeal mush did not have a brand, did not have a distribution network, did not have a national advertising campaign, and did not have a packaging format that could be placed on a grocery store shelf and chosen by a consumer who had never met the person who grew the corn. Quaker Oats is the proof of concept. It demonstrated that the American breakfast was not fixed, that it could be repositioned by marketing as effectively as it could be changed by price or technology. That lesson was learned, and the most consequential application of it came a decade later. Edward Bernays and the breakfast that was sold to America. In the mid-1920s, Edward Bernays was commissioned by Beechnut Packing Company, one of the country's major bacon producers, with a specific commercial objective: increase bacon sales. Bernays did not design a bacon advertisement. He understood, from the work he had already done, that direct advertising operates on the surface of a culture, while the deeper layer, what people believe is normal, correct, and expected, is far more powerful and far more durable than any individual campaign. To sell more bacon, he did not tell Americans that bacon was good. He changed what Americans believed a proper breakfast required. His method was documented in his own writings. He reached out to physicians, a significant number of them, and posed a straightforward question: was a hearty breakfast or a light breakfast more beneficial to the health of the average American? The majority answered that a hearty breakfast was preferable. Bernays publicized those responses nationally through newspapers and the emerging infrastructure of the press release, physicians endorsing a hearty breakfast, and positioned alongside that endorsement, presented as the natural embodiment of what a hearty breakfast looked like: bacon and eggs. The campaign worked. The pairing of bacon and eggs as the standard American breakfast, the default, the normal, the thing you ordered at a diner without thinking about it, the thing you made on a Sunday morning because that was simply what Sunday morning breakfast was not inherited from 2 centuries of American food tradition. It was positioned there by a public relations practitioner hired to sell more bacon, who understood that the most effective way to sell a product was to make its absence seem like a deficiency. Bacon and eggs as a standard daily breakfast pairing is younger than cornmeal mush, younger than salt cod cakes, younger than buckwheat pancakes, fried mush, Johnny cakes, red-eye gravy, stewed prunes, and molasses biscuits. Every food on this list that it replaced had been on American breakfast tables for decades or centuries before the Beechnut campaign ran. The breakfast most Americans alive today grew up considering simply traditional, the one they picture when they picture breakfast, the one that shows up in diners and hotel buffets and Sunday morning kitchens without anyone asking why, is younger than what it displaced. That is what the documented record shows. It shows nothing else on this subject with more clarity. The things that were there before it did not disappear because they were inferior. They disappeared because nobody was paid to keep them on the table.